Okay, welcome everyone. I'm really happy that you show up in such huge numbers. Andy, what do you think about this?
Yeah,
compared to last year, this is amazing.
Good.
Does it make you feel more nervous?
No.
No. Okay, great. So this is the one and only Andy Farnell. And I've asked him to be really, cautious in terms of how much you can follow him, because he can really go off into horribly advanced things very quickly. So I will ask him to follow you and ask you to stop him when he verges off. And you can also do this when he does something really basic. So kind of keep giving him the clues. The general topic of the talk is granular synthesis. Microsound starts to meet physical modeling kind of thing. So it is actually where we stopped with APDI last year. So this is the kind of advanced, extra, amazing Andy Farnell.
Cheers, guys. Great. It's awesome to be back here again, and I've got mixed briefs for today. I'm going to try and cover things which, because most of you I know are on music technology, and you're really looking for musical applications for this kind of thing. However, I'm coming at it from a sound design perspective. And so it's going to be kind of useful in post-production, and again, obviously for games, generative, procedural approaches to game sound, for atmospheres, for ambiences, and for games world objects, interactive objects and things like that. There's no reason why you can't turn any of this to a musical application. You just kind of use different waveforms and a slightly different approach. So let's just kind of get back to the basics of what we're talking about. We're talking about a particular synthesis method. What are the methods? Those of you that have studied communications might remember something like an OSI type model, where you have layers of abstraction going from the most real, the most physical, if you like, all the way up to the most abstract at the top. And this helps you break up complex tasks into like slices of a cake, so that you can deal with them. You can take out hopefully one of the layers and replace it with another abstraction which talks above and below on the interfaces and substitutes exactly for the last one that you had. So methods are one of the layers in this cake. And the layers of the cake are, if you like, implementation, which is your most basic physical layer. That's the nuts and bolts of how you actually produce the sound. Now it could be real physics. It could be you're going to use pieces of cardboard, string, tin cans, microphones, and so on. It could be collage with found sounds, small recordings, pieced together, music concrete style. This kind of approach. Obviously, more often these days, it's involving one of a number of kinds of synthesis, and they're generally going to be implemented in a synthesis programming language, such as Csound, Super Collider, Pure Data, Max MSP, right? The idea is that all of these synthesis languages would be kind of interchangeable and live in some equivalence class. So if you were good at synthesis and you were good at using one of the tools, you should really be able to switch to another one with a minimum overhead, and maybe within 4 or 5 weeks be able to produce the same kind of work. Obviously, some of the implementations are stronger at doing certain things than others. Now, Csound's brilliant at doing very, very detailed offline renderings with huge files and things. Super Collider and Pure Data are much better at kind of fast, interactive, kind of real-time design of synthesizers. So this is one of our layers. It's the implementation. Starting from the top, the topmost layer you might call the behavioural layer, which is how does a sounding object, how does something that's either in your virtual reality games world or in a plugin in your studio, how does that respond to high-level control data, be it from a keyboard, some kind of Kinect type gesture interface, something detecting the motion of a bow, the tapping on a table with a microphone, However you're going to try and get data in to control your system is going to go through the behavioural level at the top, and that is going to send data to what you call, at the second level down, is the model. It's the model of your sound object. How does it respond to certain gestures? So for instance, the model of a piano really is 88 separate idiophonic percussion instruments that happen to live in the same box. Yeah. A model of a football, when you're a basketball that you're bouncing along the ground, would be a spherical sealed resonator under pressure, colliding alternately with one surface and then another, so the hand and the ground. So you kind of have a high-level physical description of what the thing is. That's your model. What connects the model to the implementation is your set of methods. And excuse me. Traditionally, we study additive, which you could liken to Lego blocks. You're going to piece together your sound in the frequency domain, well, in time frequency really, but mainly in the frequency domain, as a composition of atomic basis waveforms being sine waves. Okay. So they're extended in the time axis. You're going to choose a group of sine waves, and you're going to like build the sound atomically from little Lego blocks. The converse way of looking at another method is subtractive, which sometimes people liken to sculpture, where you start with a block of marble, you chip away all the bits that you don't want, and what you're left with is the sound you're after. Right? Does that make sense to people? They're complementary methods, additive and subtractive. Another method is non-linear methods of wave shaping, and some of the modulation methods like FM. And it's interesting that they're actually very, very similar to each other mathematically. One involves a transfer function and putting a basis waveform through a transfer function. The other one involves modulating the phase/frequency of that basis waveform, but they end up giving you the same results, which is a kind of spreading of the energy into sidebands, which are under the control based on feedback paths or the intensity of the modulator and the transfer function. This method is possibly more best to think of as plasticine or clay. So I think all of the methods have a good analogy in fine arts, right? Lego blocks for additive, sculpture for subtractive. I mean, because the block of stuff that you've got to chip away from is fixed, be it noise or another more complex initial waveform. Wave shaping and FM like clay or plasticine because you have a sort of fixed volume, if you like, a fixed spectra, and you can spread that energy into other places. But the one that we're going to look at today is a method, and it's a very popular method, and this is the Microsound or Granular style of method. And what we do is, rather than analysing the sound into an exciter and a set of filters or into a set of basis waveforms that we add together, we treat the entire time domain set of data that we've got as a jigsaw puzzle. And we smash it into little tiny pieces. And then we can take these little tiny pieces, a bit like pointillistic painting, and we can just put dots here and some dots here. And if you've ever kind of walked up to one of these giant lithographically printed posters, like advertising board or whatever, when you get up really close, all you can see is red, blue and cyan dots. You see little clusters of 3 dots, and some are bigger than others, and there's no picture there at this very close-up level. You have to step back, and then you can see the picture emerge. This is a very good analogy for what's going to be going on with granular synthesis. So what we're interested in is atomic sounds which are short, generally in the range of 1 to about 20 milliseconds. Over 20 milliseconds, we start to be able to recognize what those fragments are as individual sounds, if you like. But below 20 milliseconds, because of the way that hearing works, which turns out to be a little bit more complex than the cochlea as a spectrogram. right? It's actually the spiking neurons produce a time frequency model of hearing, which is much more like a kind of wavelet theory, right? That events which happen below 20 milliseconds are not perceived as being pitched events which are recognizable sounds. They're just a kind of a sensation. And we call the 20 milliseconds the Garber threshold, after Dennis Garber, who came up with this acoustical quanta theory of hearing. About 1946 was when he published the paper. And he said, well, it's a little bit like light, like they used to call them corpuscles of light, when there was this tryst between the wave theory and the particle theory of light. And of course, this is where, in reconciling those two, this is where quantum theory comes from. Well, it's a very similar thing going on with sound, except that in the sound domain, we're just dealing with these very short pulses, little fragments of sound. When they're arranged together in the right way, the perception that we get of them is of a more complete and complex sound. So we're going to look at, I guess the important things are how to create grains, how to aggregate them together into sounds which are usable as sound designers, and how to choose the grains. How do we decide what these micro sounds are in order to put them together? So, who's a pure data or Max MSP programmer here? Oh dear, not many.
They're just shy. Most of them know what Max MSP. Max MSP is.
The first years haven't yet. But
Yeah.
Who's happy with this? What's happening up here? Oh, some of you. Will the rest of you forgive me if I spend a little bit of time doing some just basic signal processing with PD? I hope you'll follow along. I will try and explain what I'm doing as we go. So, what I've put up here is some objects. Obviously, there's a noise object that I use to test out, and there's a D to A converter at the bottom here. I've chosen a couple of objects called tab read and tab play. We're going to see the difference between them. Tab play simply takes a reference to a sound file stored in memory, which we're going to load in using the sound filer object. So that's going to take it from secondary storage, whatever, USB, hard disk, and bring it into RAM, where in random access memory it's much more quickly accessible. We can jump around in it much more than we can if it was on disk. Right? I'm going to load that into, and it's going to be visually represented in this array here, which is, if you like, this is a visual window of a bit of memory. And it shows the samples, 44,000 of them for 1 second here, in terms of amplitude around this 0 line. So they're normalized floats in the range +1 to -1. And we'll see them appear here. So let's load in a sound. A useful object's the open panel, because what that does is, instead of me having to type in the name of a sound, I can just click this and bring me up a file browser so I can go off and find something on the disk. That's quite nice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to feed the output of this. This is the file that it's going to find on disk, and I'm going to say, tell it to open. Is it? I forget. Let's see what sound filer wants. It wants a read. So let's read. And we'll just say $1. It takes 2 arguments. One is the name of the sound file that is discovered on disk, and the other is the destination that it's going to put it into. In this case, it's the name of our array, which is Bob. So we're going to say, take whatever you find as the output from the open panel, and please read that into Bob. Let's see if that works, and we'll go and find a sound on disk, like the amen break, yeah? And notice it's loaded in a bit of that sound file, but that's not a break. What it did is it tried to fit as much of the sound file as it could into the array. And the size of the array by default, I think, was 1,000. So it's like a tenth of a second or something. Now, we could pre-allocate the size of the array and make it big, but a smarter thing to do is to say, look, tell you what, you're a computer, you're best at stuff like this. Go and look at the size of the file on disk. Calculate based on the sample rate how long you need to allocate to the array, and then pre-allocate that size. Okay, so So there we go. We fill up our array. Great. And the tab play operator here, all it needs to receive is a trigger. In pure data, it's called a bang message. So I can just connect a button here, and that gives me a playthrough of the sound file. Let's just turn that up a little bit. There we go. And notice it starts at the beginning, ends at the end, and that's it. If I want to get a loop, what it rather nicely does is it outputs a bang message here when it's done. So it plays through, and boom, out comes the bang message to say, hey, I'm finished. A nice way to create a loop is to simply take that and say, well, look, when you're finished, just trigger it again, right? And then we'll just keep going round and round the loop. Yeah? But all it's doing is playing the sound file back as a regular sample. Yeah? Okay. And actually, the only way to stop it is to break the cable, right? So it's not very user-friendly. Okay, let's compare that to this object here, which kind of looks superficially similar. It's called tab read, Bob. Instead of taking a trigger and then playing through the sound at the original sample rate stored in the WAV file header, or at the sample rate of the project, what this does is it takes an integer, so it takes a floating point value here at the input of tab read, which is presumably in the range 0 to the number of samples which are in the file, which is going to be, let's say, for 2 seconds, 88,200 or something like that. And that's a float value, so it can be between samples. It could be, let's say, something 0.125 of a sample. Which means that it's able to access data. What it's going to do is it's going to at the output of the tab read, it's going to put the value of the sample at that index. Does that make sense? So it's just a lookup table, but because we're allowing non-integer values, presumably it's able to calculate the values between two samples, right? In other words, it can interpolate between samples. This is what we expect from any good sample playback algorithm. It's not going to sound grainy, is it can figure out from a float value between some samples what it should be. And that's what the 4 stands for in this. Tab read 4 means it uses a 4-point polynomial interpretation. It takes 2 points before and 2 points afterwards, and it tries to fit a curve through them. And that's a pretty smart way of doing it, because for some micro sample in between, it'll get a fairly good, accurate idea of what a value might be. So what we can do then is we just need to feed in a float value into the tab read here. But it's going to be between 0 and what? How many samples are stored in this? We can find that out rather easily by putting a number here. And what we'll use this number for is as an output, as a display. And we're going to use that with the output of sound filer. And that very obligingly tells us when it loads in a break how many sound samples were in that file. So it says there were 58,007 samples. So if I create a slider here, so horizontal slider, which is going to go between 0 and 58,007. Oops. And connect that up to here. I should be able to then scan through this sample just using the slider as a scrub wheel and here. Problem is this is what actually happens. Sort of works, but so what's happening is that the GUI object, the graphical user interface object of the slider, is broken up by the underlying graphics API to only have 127 steps. So even though it's got that range, it's jumping to another sample value, jumping to another sample value 127 times as I drag it across. What I'd like to do then is to smoothly interpolate all the possible values between 0 and 58,000 or whatever. And I could do that a couple of ways. A nice way to do this in PD is with a line object. So a line in the audio domain here takes 2 arguments. The first parameter being a value to move to, which we're going to say, use dollar substitution. We'll say move to the value that you got from the slider. And the second part is the time to take doing that. And I'm going to make it just be like 100 milliseconds. Like everything's in milliseconds in PD. So what I'm going to get now is a smooth transition at the output of the line, which should enable me to use this as a kind of scrub wheel, right? So I could connect this to kind of a turntable or something like that. If I want to simulate things like a tape machine, right? Which, you know, you press the button and there's a big inertia to the wheels on an old tape machine. It takes a while to zip, speed up, blah, 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 plays along, and then you hit stop and you get this very particular curve as it slows down under the friction. So a tape emulation is quite interestingly easy to do by making this value here quite short, say 10 milliseconds, and putting in a low-pass filter. And because it's an IIR, an infinite impulse response filter, the way it uses past values makes it look very much like the curve of a capacitor or any system where the rate of charge is proportional to the accumulated charge so far. Yeah, so you get this a curve which looks like this on the speeding up and like this on the downside. Does that make sense to people? Those of you that have done a bit of analog electronics, right? We're getting this kind of curve from this particular kind of IIR filter. So I just say low pass me that, and low pass me that at something like about 1 hertz, or maybe even slower, like maybe 0.3 hertz. So that's 3 seconds, right? 0.3 hertz reciprocal gives us 3 seconds as a speed up time, and then I should be able to do stuff like this. And it will just slow down automatically. So I can just kind of scrub on it and things, get quite a nice musical effect. And you can hear the interpolation in the sample player kind of giving you some decent bass and stuff down there like that. Okay, so tab read is a very powerful object in this way that it gives us random access anywhere we like into the sound file. What we'd like to do for granular synthesis, though, is to say, look, I'd like you to be able to take me a small slice of this out, maybe say between here and here, or between here and here, just grab this snare drum, and then be able to play it back at any speed we like. So let's look at ways to make a simple loop player in this case. I'm going to replace this kind of weird input device here that I've made with the low-pass filter, just with a phaser object, right? What does a phaser do? Anyone? What's the do you know what the function of a phaser is in synthesis and signal processing? Yes, sir.
It just moves the two waveforms out of sync, so one gets moved slightly along, so it gets cancelled out differently.
You're thinking of a phaser spelled with an E, and that is an audio effect. Yeah, where you take a copy of a signal and you sum it with a time-shifted version of the original, and you get notch filtering. Phasor with an O is a kind of oscillator, but it's a special kind of oscillator. Does anyone know why is it special?
Sawtooth.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a sawtooth. I mean, it's a unipolar sawtooth. It's not bipolar. So instead of coming from -1 up to +1 and then having an average, no DC offset, it's got an average signal value of 0, it's asymmetrical. It sits on 0 and it's unipolar. So it goes from 0 up to 1 and then instantly back down again. 0 up to 1, instantly back down again. So we can use it as an index for another lookup table. And this is the basis of all wavetable synthesis and most oscillators, is you start with a phaser and then you use it to look up the contents of another table. Presumably one that starts and ends on 0 and contains a waveform. Yeah? What we're going to do, though, is we're going to use the phaser to just scan through the sample table once every second. Right? So I'm going to multiply the output of the phaser by the number of samples in the table. So I take this phaser. If you want to actually see this working, it's always nice to be able to do this sort of thing. Put an object in and have a metro running at 100. So every 100 milliseconds I'm going to update another tab right this time. So I'm going to write into a table, yeah? And I'm going to tab right into just O for oscilloscope or something like that. So let's hook the phaser up to that. And let's put an array down here, which is our oscilloscope, O, with 1,000 points. Polygon, yeah. I'll just pop that here. And we'll switch the metronome on by using a toggle button. This is like a checkbox, so when it's checked on, now that's working. And you can see the phaser is moving between 0 and 1 over and over again. And it's taking 1 second to move up there. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, cool. I'm going to just show you what you'd expect to see when that is set up to something like 100 times a second. There you go, sawtooth, like you said, but it's a sawtooth that's sitting on 0. Right. Okay, so let's make this very slow again, just once per second. But instead of now scanning between 0 and 1, I'd like it to scan between 0 and the length of the table. So I'm going to say multiply that by, what did we say? It was 58,007 samples or something like that, right? So that's what the output of the phaser is going to go to there. And I'm going to hook it into here now. So what it's doing is it's running around that table, treating it like an oscillator. Right? Let's put a horizontal slider on this. Set the speed that we up to maybe 4 times a second. We can also make the phaser, instead of going from 0 to 1, make it go from 1 to 0. So we can flip it over, which we can do by timing it by -1. Yeah? Oh, it's going negative. Oh, okay, I know why. Let's do this instead. We'll make this negative. We can go backwards as well, yeah? There's 0 in the middle. Does that make sense to everyone about how we can scan anywhere we like in this table? Yeah. Okay, so if we want to pick a particular chunk of the table, what we need to do maybe is instead of starting at 0, we could start maybe at some offset, and instead of finishing at 1, we could finish at some value less than 1, and pick out maybe just a kick drum or a snare drum or something like that. So there's a kind of classic beat slicer way of doing stuff. Oh, there's something that we should probably notice here. This number that I'm getting from Soundfiler, you know, I'm manually typing that number into here, which is a bit dumb. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take this number and I'm going to say, can you put that into here? Because that's going to be my multiplier for the length of the table. Okay. So let's load up another sound file. This will be overridden by the new value, so we'll take an amen break or something. And I'm going to make my phaser, I'm going to manipulate the phaser by doing stuff like this. Let's say it's going to move between 0 and 1, but I'm going to add a value to it. So let's just 0 to that. And I'm going to say that start at, so I'm going to add, using a plus, 0.5. So this is what it would be like if it's playing all of the sound sample. It's slower. And I'm going to make it start at 0.5. So it's still playing all the way through the phaser, but it's kind of starting here, yeah? Does that make sense? So it's missing out the second half of the sample, yeah? And I can make this value be anything I want. I can start it here at 1.25. So starting on the snare now, like, or on the 8th beat there. Put the value in where I want to start. Obviously it's a break that's cut into 16, so if I'm choosing halves and quarters, I'm getting some quite good results fairly easily, right? Right, so I'm able to produce this, this fragment of the sound, and it could be as long or as short as I want it to be. But what I'd like to be able to do is to have this fragment enveloped with an amplitude so that it fades in and then it fades out again. And the reason that I'm going to do that is so that when I create other small fragments of sound and I start to mix them together, instead of just getting this very abrupt collage, I'm going to end up with these little grains of sound fading in, and as they fade out, another one's going to fade in. So I'm going to try and create a density of grains such that I never actually hear any spaces. As these little fragments of sound are fading out, other ones are fading into replacement, and we'll get this constant average amplitude. Does that make sense to people as our method? Okay. So how could we make it so that I could choose a place in this sound file and automatically have it fade in and out? What I'll do is I'll replace the phaser with a line. And I'll say, look, the line object, I'd like you to just start at 0 and move to 1 in, what should we say, 300 milliseconds or something like that. So what's this doing? It's just giving me a way to just trigger the grain like this. That's a little bit too quick. Yeah, like that. Playing through the whole sound sample. Right. So I'm going to derive from this line, which is moving between 0 and 1, an envelope function which starts at 0 and ends at 0, but somewhere in between it's non-zero. And it doesn't matter too much what shape that is, for now. Okay. What we'll see later on is it actually, in terms of the spectral effect on very small grains, it matters a lot, because what we're effectively doing is amplitude modulation. So depending on the shape of the enveloping function, we'll introduce sidebands. Yeah. An envelope function that's very, very easy to make is the triangular envelope function. So over the duration which our envelope moves between 0 and 1, we want our envelope function to move between 0 and 1 and back to 0 again. Can you see the mathematical relationship that we need to establish between the line, which is scanning through the grain, and the envelope function? It's the same way that we make a triangle wave from a sawtooth wave. Using pure arithmetic. So this is not a harmonically additive method or something. We're not using Fourier and lining sine waves. We're just going to take a slope and we're going to do some arithmetic shit to it to make it stop being a sawtooth and be a triangle wave. This would be really nice to have a whiteboard, but I'm going to try and explain it to you with hands. Okay.
So give you the document camera.
No, it's okay. It was too much faff.
It's actually quite quick.
Is it? Okay, that's fine.
And you have a pen and paper, yeah?
Yeah.
Because you just switch it here to webcam.
And here's a pen.
And there is a pen. All we need is a white piece of paper. That's not it.
Hey, that's groovy. Right.
Yeah, there you go.
See this?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try this.
Looks good.
Okay, so our triangle, our sawtooth is looking like this, sitting on the 0 axis. Okay, like that. And during this period, from here to here, we'd like our envelope waveform. Let's just kind of I'm not going to get many goes at this. Over this time period here, we'd like our envelope function to do this, which is to move all the way up to 1 and move all the way back down to 0 again. So at the time where this is 0.5, we want this here to be 1, and at the time where this is 1, we want this to have returned to 0. So what are the basic operations that we have to hand? They are addition and multiplication, including multiplication by -1, which will flip the phase of something. So what I can do is in order to get a copy of this sawtooth wave, which is flipped over in phase, I multiply it by -1, and I end up with this, So it's mirrored around the time axis. And then I'm going to add 1 to it. So I'm going to shift it up so that it now sits along with the original one on this time axis. So it's like this. Now you should be able to see in this diagram, here is our triangle wave. It's hidden there inside the diagram. And the way that I'm going to get it is I'm going to only look for that part of the signal which is the smallest at any time. So on the way up it's going to be this one, and on the way down it's going to be this one. And the function that I use to do that is called the min operator. So a min is like it's like a binary operator, like plus or times or something. It takes 2 inputs and it returns 1 output. The output being the smallest of its 2 input arguments. Yeah. So the min, say, of 10 and 3 is 3. The min of 5 and minus 1 is minus 1. Yeah. Whichever's the smallest, that's what we get. So this is the very, very simple way. Oh, how do I?
Just the VG.
Yeah, great,
Yep.
Cool, thank you. So let's do this with.
It only goes up to 0.5 amplitude.
Sorry?
Does that mean it only goes as high as 0.5?
Correct, at the moment. So we're going to rescale it afterwards, right? So what we can do as a final correction to that is to multiply by 2. That make sense? We're going to have to rescale it. Yeah, well done, well spotted. So let's put in here a phasor at 100. Oh dear, come on. And I'm just going to demo it here. Okay. And let's see these operations actually working. I'm going to take a copy of this and times it by -1. And it's going to look like this now. Right, you see it's flipped around the time axis. Okay. And then I'm going to add 1 to it. Plus 1. And this is going to shift it up, so it's sitting back where it was before, only it's going from 1 to 0 instead of 0 to 1. If I look at the original, it's doing that. And what I'm now going to do is to take the min of this and the copy that's been flipped and shifted. So I'm going to say, give me the min of these two. And that now gives me a very handy triangular function. And as Matey over there pointed out, if I actually want that to be the right amplitude, I'm going to have to scale that up by 2. Okay.
So can you say something, why don't you use another triangle oscillator in this case? Why do you derive it from the phasor?
Because I always want the position, the amplitude of this to be phase locked to what my function is that I'm scanning into the table. So for every grain, I don't have to worry about creating a separate envelope generator. I just want to get an envelope generator for free that's always phase synchronous with the index of the grain. And this is a very cheap and easy way to do it. Just to derive it's called a Hanning window. Okay, so that's the a triangular method of doing it. So let's see what happens then if we take this arrangement here and move it over to here, where we're going to use it like this. Let's say this triangular function generator. I'll take the output of the line, flip it, add 1 to it, and then combine it with the minimum of the line, so that will that work on here? So that when I press this, we should see it rise up and then down to 0 every time I trigger this. And I'm going to use that to scan my table, sound filer, amen break, and okay, so I haven't enveloped it yet. Now I need to take this and use one more multiplier stage here, and we now have basically a grain generator. So every time I trigger it, it fades in and fades out automatically. This idiom that you're seeing here is the core of all of the next two patches that I'm going to show you, with a couple of twists. First of all, we're not actually using a triangular function in the other patches. We're using a raised cosine function. Sorry, I called that a Hamming. This is our Hamming window. This is our triangular window, which is going to produce more artifacts because of the point at the top. The raised cosine window we do by basically taking the cosine of the line function and just getting 1/2 of it and dividing it by 2 and adding 1 to it, so it sits up on 0. Yeah. But this thing here, over on the left, is the heart of all of the patches that I'm going to show you now. I just kind of want to justify this. I really wanted to show you how to do this from the ground up, the nuts and bolts. It'd be very easy to just go to these next patches and say, well, here's a grain generator, and here's how I'm going to use it. And you're thinking, well, what the fuck's a grain generator? Well, that's the atom of how we're building all of the rest of these patches. So we're going to get rid of it now. It's not necessary. And instead, I'd like to open. Where are we? To 9, I think. Yeah. So let's have a look at this one, which is this is a granular ambience generator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to load in a sound file. You can see the raised cosine envelope there. It's actually been pre-computed, so I'm using a table to look this one up. And I'm just going to pick grains randomly out of the sound file around some point, which is determined by this slider over here, which kind of just sets the offset in the table. And then I'm going to choose some random amount just before that value and a random amount just after it, and then scan maybe about 20 or 30 milliseconds of the sound file and enveloping it by the raised cosine. So let's try it with the amen break, because we've been listening to that for a bit, but it probably works better with voices or something like that, maybe. Have we got one in here? You see a WAV file in here?
You're only looking at...
I'm only looking at PDs. Yeah. Hold on, if I do this, should be... Can't I see WAVs? No, okay. Annoyingly, my sounds are kind of somewhere else in a weird place. So let's just try that. So there's the sound file, and I'm going to just put this to some location in the sound file. That's the end, that's the beginning. And I'm going to start randomly picking grains out of here. This is the playback rate of the grain. And this is the duration of the grain. That's kind of over the top of the kick drum, yeah? And we're just grabbing these grains out and then layering over the top of each other to create a texture. Try it with something there goes all my memory. Oh, it could be really long. So this is one of the dangers of working with a DSP language which doesn't do any kinds of bounds checking. If you tell it to load a 6 GB file and you've only got like 2 GB of RAM in your laptop, it will go, yeah, sure, I can do that. Oh, quite interesting. I have no idea what this actually is. This kind of thing works very well on voices, string instruments, brass, anything that's periodic and sustained. You can use a granular texture generator like this just to find the nice bit of the file and create a sustained texture with it. And you can map that to MIDI and put it on the keyboard and stuff. Notice that I've got a reverb on the output of this as well, which really helps to bind the grains together. Otherwise, it sounds just a little bit too raw and a little bit rough. Okay, well, what you probably noticed then is I set the grain playback rate to in order to control the pitch, but where I was picking the grains from was basically fixed, and there was some like random, we call it a cloud of grains coming from around that point in the file. What if I leave the frequency of the rate at which I play the grains back to be at the original rate, and then I move the point at which I'm choosing the grains from very slowly through the file at such a rate that it moves from 0 to the end of the file in the same time as it would do to play back that sound naturally. What I'll get then is a granular resynthesis of the original sound file. It's just that we've taken it, we smashed it into lots and lots of little pieces, and then we basically reassembled them like a jigsaw, and hopefully now you can't see the lines where the pieces of the jigsaw are put back together. Does that make sense? Okay. What we can then do once we've achieved that is two tricks which are flip sides of the same method kind of effects which appeared first in the 1990s under the acronym SOLA, spelled PSOLA, which is phase synchronous overlap and add methods. And from them come the original time stretch and pitch shift. So time stretch is we keep the playback rate of every grain as it was originally, and then we process through the sound file from 0 to the end, but more slowly than it would take to naturally play the sound back. Yeah, this is the basis of elastic audio in Logic and all these kinds of things. Yeah? Obviously, as it moves from 0 to the end of the file, there'll be more copies of the grains than there would be if we played it back at the original rate. Does that sit well with people? Yeah.
So it adds copies in to fill the gaps.
Yeah. So as in fact, if we just stopped moving the playback index of the grains, we'd get this effect. It would just stay there, with that. You just hear the like the frozen version of the sound. I mean, if you lived through drum and bass in the end of the 90s, you will know all of these effects really, really well. And they first appeared on an Eventide mod, and then on the Yamaha SPX series of effects processors around about like 1994, 93 maybe. So you started to get this kind of ability. Before that, it was really difficult to take a drum break and fit another arbitrary drum break respecting the pitch into the same time frame, right? Obviously, you could speed it up, but then things might not mix in the timbral and harmonic aspects of the music. Does that make sense? Yeah, time stretch is a huge shift in what you can do in this kind of electronic music production. So we're going to see this algorithm now repurposed to do time stretch and pitch shift. Just for those of you that are interested, here's our grain generator. Well, I'm just busting that open so you can see it. That's pretty much what I just made for you at the beginning, but it's embellished quite a lot with lots of parameters. So you can see, where's our, here's our actual tab read, and here's the envelope function happening, and this is reading from the envelope table, and I'm parameterizing the pitch of the grain by adding, or rather multiplying, these indexes into the table. So we're instantiating many copies of this and using those to make the grains. Now, if you want these patches, they're all on the there's a tarball of all the stuff that's in my book and on my old website that is kind of going around. You shouldn't find it too hard to find. Okay, so let's close this one up and open this next version. Which is are there any questions on the static grain generator that I just showed you? Any thoughts how you might use that or improve on it? Yes?
Well, I was mainly wondering just about it. What do all the sort of variables like R, T, V, F sort of stand for? Are they predetermined from?
No, those are all user-defined parameters that I've put in there as the synth designer. And what those were, most of them were called receiver objects, and they were picking up from parameters that have been globally broadcast in the patch. So there's many ways of building sub-patches and sub-functions and abstractions, if you like, the building blocks of synthesizer patches. And one of them is to have like global variables, and you just broadcast them. You say, every instance of a PD patch that's open in my environment, if you can hear me, listen to this variable name. Yeah, listen on this variable name, and I'm going to broadcast a value to that. Yeah? And that's what you were seeing. Yeah? Global variables being picked up. So they were defined by me. Yeah, we can see it in this patch here. So for instance, both of these sample grain objects, there's only two of them in this patch, by the way. As one fades out, the other one fades in. They're doing this, yeah? A good version of this, a much better one, has 3 or 4 phases, so they'll be like 90 degrees out of phase. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load the sound file into this table here, and then I'm going to set the playback rate and the pitch of the individual grains independently from each other, so we can hear these two classic effects. I shouldn't have moved my folders. Sorry guys, I've been a real dick and lost my my folder of sounds. There we go. Huh. Let's use this then. So that point is just frozen at some point in the sound file, and I'm going to say set the speed at which you play these back and the pitch of them to sort of nominal values around 0 in the middle, yeah? So there we go, 0 and 0. And then just hit this button. You can hear this sort of slightly watery effect because I'm only using 2 versions of the grains overlapping with each other. It sounds like it's a little bit broken up. If I get the length of this just right, it shouldn't be so apparent. Now you can know it's worse there, isn't it? There we go. That's about the right length of the grain to make it not sound so fluttery. But what I'm going to do then is I'm going to change the speed of it, but leave the pitch of the grains where they are. So. And that's the kind of original time stretch effect, you know, from like mid-90s with phase synchronous overlap and add. and speeding it up. You know, it sounds a little bit chopped, but it's going to fit into the bar where we want it to. Leaving the speed at the right at 0, and then let's move this. That's pitching it up and pitching it down, right, but maintaining the same length. So granular resynthesis gives us independent access to the apparent pitch of the sound and to the length of its playback. And in the earlier example, it doesn't have to be a linear playback from beginning to end. We were just randomly picking sound grains out. So if you look at the sort of classic academic literature on granular synthesis, people, Miller Paquette's done some, Curtis Rhodes, Xenakis, people like that use it in really interesting compositional ways. We'll often do things like create a large pool of sounds, some vocal ones, some orchestral strings, some drum sounds or whatever, and then create layers of grain clouds and program a composition such that it will move through different locations in a space of mixes of grains. Does that make sense? So you get these very dramatically shifting textures, which will be like a big kind of orchestra sound, which will morph into a solo voice, which will then sort of morph into a big crowd of people. The other very interesting thing that you can do with granular synthesis is right now all of my grains are just being summed and sent to the DAC. So this is really kind of pedestrian sound effects production. What you can do in more elaborate compositions is every grain can have its own space in a spatial audio system. So we could choose the length of playback of the grain and its pitch, but we could decide where to pan it in say in a quad space or a 5-1 or an ambisonic setup, and we could set its apparent distance. You know, we could maybe apply a filter to it, give it some kind of less direct sound and more reverberant sound, so it sounds like it's off in the distance, and we can have huge clouds of sounds kind of moving towards us, forming into apparently very loud single point sources, then breaking apart again and crazy stuff like that. So what we can do spatially with granular synthesis is quite powerful. Is everyone kind of happy with the basic concepts of how to do this and maybe some of the applications? Yeah. Okay. Would you be happy now if I move on to show you how I use the method of granular synthesis and microsound as a way of thinking about sound design of ordinary everyday objects? Okay. The one that I always bring out in our sound design lectures is fire, because fire's a really, really easy one to understand. If you listen to a recording of fire, you will identify 3 very specific kinds of sounds that you could, if you just, as an exercise, try to name them. It's a great thing to do in sound design, is do a listening exercise and say, what are the things that I can hear in that sound? Can I write down their names? And people normally end up saying, well, I can hear crackling, and I can hear hissing, and I can hear rumbling. Notice that those words all end with ing, so that they're gerund verb forms. That in English they're ing words, they're doing words, they're verbs. This is a very important point in sound design, from a sound design philosophy, is that sound is a branch of dynamics. So it's about things that happen, it's about actions and verbs, not about nouns and names of things. In other words, what we're trying to identify is processes. Hence the expression procedural audio. Procedural audio is, in one sense, looking for the underlying processes that create a sound and then replicating those processes. And it turns out with fire, because there's 3 distinct physical processes, which in the model layer we notice are thermodynamic processes. The crackling is the explosion of bits of fuel where pressure is built up inside. The hissing is the escaping of gas through small apertures. You get like a hissing sound from turbulence as the gas escapes. And the rumbling is what happens to flames when gas burns in the air. It creates these random or chaotic patterns in the bass frequencies from around about 30 hertz or so, as the flames dance around in the atmosphere. So we've got a sound that the flames and the crackles and the smoke and the escaping steam all make as processes, and then we're going to then model them as grains. So we're going to produce little grain generators that make these, and our hypothesis is once we connect them all together, we'll get the sound of fire. So this is the exercise that I often do with my students, where we say, right, let's quit this and go to maybe here. Yeah. So got a bunch of these organised in a nicer way. So we're going to build little generators that do things like this. Right? It's just a crackle, right? How is that generated? It's always a bit small up there. There's a noise source. There's a line which produces a grain which has a very sharp attack and a very short decay, really 20 milliseconds, just enveloping that burst of noise. And that just produces a very, very rough ballpark synthesis of a crack. It could be a kind of little hi-hat or whatever. But that's all we need. And what we want to do is we want to make a cloud of those, which is kind of random. So we noticed by analysing our file, like what are the parameters of that grain type, of that microsound type? Are they all the same length? No, some of them are much shorter, some of them are 2 or 3 milliseconds, some of them are a lot longer. Do they all have exactly the same timbre, the same spectrum within that burst of noise? Well, no. I mean, just from a purely theoretical point of view, no two bursts of truly randomly generated noise would have the same spectrum, right? So they're all slightly different, but more to the point that we can use a filter to shape them. We can make some of them dull, some of them bright, some of them a bit more middly. Are they all the same amplitude? No. Okay, some of them are loud and some of them are quiet, and so on. So, do they all seem to come from the same place? No. Well, maybe we could just randomise them spatially. So we decide on what are the parameters for our microsounds, and like you saw with the grain generator before, we'll construct a synthesizer that allows us to put them into the parameter spaces that make the most sense. And you end up with something a bit like this. This is the crackle generator. This one's not too difficult to understand, right? Oh yeah, so maybe it's, but yeah, here. I mean, I've got a bandpass filter. I'm using a weird way of generating the randomness up there. But this is just randomly modulating the center of this filter and the resonance slightly as well. The decay time of this envelope is being randomly modulated between 0 and 20 milliseconds. And I'm using the noise to actually generate random figures as well in this example. So that's, when we're happy with that, we'll say, okay, that's one of our textures, that's one of our components to being able to produce fire. Let's move on to the next one and treat it completely independently, right, to begin with. Yes, sir?
What would happen if you activated all 3 cracking sounds at once?
Well, you can hear that. There's no problem intrinsically with that. In that you just get gentle crackles, right? Because, and I think what your question might actually be there, I hope I'm not putting words into your mouth and misinterpreting things, but your concern was that I've got a D to A in here, and I've got a D to A in the other patch. Can they coexist? Yeah, absolutely. However many PD patches, and the same is true in Super Collider and Max MSP, all of these synthesis frameworks implicitly sum the output if you add multiple copies of the DAC. So it's a kind of, there's a digital summing junction implicitly in those. It doesn't matter if you have many copies of the same patch running, they'll just kind of add up, right? Yeah. Okay, here we go with the hissing, and in this patch I've kind of got something similar going on. There's some noise. I'm using noise and a low-pass filter to generate a slowly moving random signal, and I'm using that then to amplitude modulate the other noise source to get something that sounds a bit like this. It's a bit rubbish, right? It sounds like somebody rubbing a microphone windshield or a bad connection. And what we're generally doing in this kind of sound design is an iterative design. We construct it how we want, and then we say, what's wrong with it? Let's take that again. Let's try and improve it. So in this next version, we've high pass filtered the noise, and we've expanded the random low frequency oscillator to have more silence in it and be a bit more bursty. So we get this kind of effect instead. Mostly silence, yeah? I mean, every now and again, you know, a little burst of hissing coming through, yeah? And you know, and as a listening exercise, do this. Like, listen to some real fire. Try and isolate it using the EQ. Get a parametric EQ and try and find that sound in your texture and study it. Listen to it. See what it's doing, and then try and create your synthesis to copy the behaviour of that element of the sound. In this case here, we're mimicking the roaring sound of the flames, which is kind of this. That's a bit too much, that one, I think. Yeah, that's a really basic version. Very similar to what we call a doom tone in sound design, right? It's just noise, 1 octave down there around about 60 or 70 hertz. Use this in cinema a lot to indicate supernatural forces or space force choking somebody, or all that kind of stuff, yeah? And often, you know, in psychological dramas or something, that will be just mixed in underneath as a sort of sense of foreboding. Does anybody know why the doom tone does that psychologically?
It's the sound inside the womb, maybe.
I think that one of the best explanations I've heard is that anything that has got that much bass energy in it must be physically very energetic and therefore very dangerous. So the most primitive forms of that are stampeding hooves, thunderstorms, things that you'd want to get out the way of, probably an avalanche, right? So you have a real primal limbic response to this sound of like, I don't like that. That's unnerving. We want something a little bit more subtle for the flames. I'm gonna, because of the time constraints, I'm gonna move on really quickly now to show you what happens when we put together all of these components. And what I've done is I've wrapped a nice interface around them. What's important in terms of presentation when you build plugins or you're building tools for other artists to use, if you become a developer, is that you don't name parameters things like filter phase shift or something like that. You give them nice names that mean something to the operator, like flames, sparks, you know, stuff like that. And behind the scenes, these sliders are just hooked up to the more complex DSP parameters. So I can, let's just pick some presets here. We can do stuff like liquid fire, wood fire, much more crackles in it. And then we can change like the intensity of the fire, right? Fierce fire, more stuff going. Not much space in it. Okay, there's 3 or 4 short asides that I want to say about this. First of all, we're able to do incredible things in VR with procedural synthesis of sounds, especially ones that are based on grains. Because of this ability to spatialize things, rather than having point sources, which you'd have if you had a sound sample kind of playing back, we're able to create what we call volumetric extents, which is I, as the avatar, the player, moving through the VR space. If I'm moving through some like a forest fire or something, where does the sound of the fire come from? It comes from all around me. Right? It comes from over here, it comes from over here. And so I'm able to move through this sound space, hearing that place is on fire. For other volumetric extents might be things like rain, where you're moving through rain and it's hitting objects all around you, like car roofs, puddles, leaves on trees. But you actually want to hear the individual components of that sound relative to the virtual observer's position. And such that if you move your head around in the VR space, then the entire sound seed, the sources, the granular sources in that volumetric extent will rotate with the player's head position. Does that make sense? Yeah. So for immersive sound, it's essential to move away from samples towards procedural methods in order to get this kind of immersive potential. The second thing is that we're not actually sending any data. When we're making a game using procedural audio, we're not actually packaging any data as assets. At the height of the data-driven way of doing things in game audio, and this is never going to go away, but it's part of the landscape, like for music and dialogue and stuff. You get like 8 or 9 gigabytes of sound data on a Blu-ray disc. It's crazy. One of the big problems for distributing mobile games, which is one of the biggest emerging markets, is the cost of data. And especially in the UK, where data plans are outrageous. We have the worst internet service in the world, I think. If you go to civilized countries like Finland or something, homeless people get more free internet than my 50 quid a month package.
Way worse in Australia.
Is it?
Australia have one of the worst internet.
Okay, I mean, I don't know what's kind of gone wrong in the commercialisation of the internet. Sorry for my little political asides, but I can't help myself, right? Is that we have this amazing bottleneck which allows the telcos to completely exploit the situation and under-provide bandwidth and make sure that it's very, very, very expensive compared to its real production cost. Yeah. So what you end up with is a potential for a huge market in mobile games, but nobody wants to pay. People getting stung, they download an app and suddenly it downloaded 10 gig of data. This stuff, procedural content generation, is brilliant for this problem because what it does is you supply the rules to make the content to the endpoint, to the client. And the client then synthesizes the content, be it visual or audio. So we trade off data against CPU. Does that make sense? Yeah? We compute the assets that we want at the point of delivery. So when we use this, we're not sending sounds of fire, we're just sending the rules to make sounds of fire. And what we're actually doing is we're running this code in the games engine. So there is no sound, we don't record this to a WAV file and then put it into the game. We supply a plugin, usually for a framework like Unity. The UWE's game engine allows you to put plugins now, and you can compile procedural audio PD patches using a compiler called Heavy into formats that will work with these major middleware games engines. So you now supply your code, which executes at runtime for things like footsteps. But today's lesson is all about textures with granular synthesis. So you're looking at, these are great things: wind, rain, oceans, waterfalls, fire, sounds of crowds, sounds of urban ambiences, jungles with birds and things. Anything that's a big volumetric extent with lots of sound sources in it, you're able to produce using these kind of granular methods, and then run them in the client. Okay. I just wanted to say something about the gestalt nature of this. It's a permanent marker. A loaded permanent marker around. I'm just going to use this. Here we go. Okay, what's this? It's a dot. What's this? 2 dots.
It's a conflict.
I'm not going to try and communicate with you in Morse code. Okay, what's this? Okay, completely different thing. Like suddenly it's taken form. This is the Gestalt process where our senses, in order to trigger a particular schema, i.e. to recognize something that's made up of component parts, if they're put together in the right configuration, we have a different experience than perceiving individually those different parts. Now, what you heard with the fire generator there was a classic case of a Gestalt in sound design. The 3 individual sound effects are pretty crappy, right? Those crackles were just some of the worst crackles that you could ever have. These little bits of noise, right? They call this like the Vincent van Gogh School of Sound Design. Because you've got to have one ear for it to sound any good. Right? No, not really. What Van Gogh did in art is efficiency. If you look at his pictures, they're very clever because there's not much in them. He's a master of cartoon, of caricature. When you look at there's not much in it. It's just a few lines, and you go, oh wow, yeah, that looks exactly like that, you know, but it's not. It's just the lines. Sound design is very good when you do it this way, minimally. You put just what you need there and no more to suggest each of the important parts. And when they're mixed together in just the right ratio, people go, aha, that sounds like fire. And not only that, people often say, that's the most realistic fire I've ever heard, right? Because real recordings of fire, and this is often the case in theatrical and film and game sound design, the real is not real enough. You know, it's this phenomenon of needing hyper-reality and needing to be able to finely tune the cartoon-like nature of the sound. Another advantage that you get from these kinds of methods is that they leave a lot of space, spectrally and temporally, for other things to fit in. So stuff that's generated like this will tend to work better with a dialogue over it, will work better than with real recordings. Because actually you've got more control over this, and you can choose like the maximum transient amplitude of the crackles or something in such a way that it always sits nicely with the dialogue. You've got very fine-grained control over it. And the last thing to say about this, as a kind of aside, is that lots of people assume that I created this idea of procedural audio based on process. And that wherever I teach it, we always do hard sums and DSP and synthesis. And that's not the case. I want to kind of underscore how the philosophy of breaking sound down into a process works regardless of the implementation layer, right? Of how you do it. So, and then another version of this exercise that I do for like young kids, like I say, we're going to do sound design and we're going to make fire. And I go in with a big bag of some pieces of wood, some sticks, some newspaper, and some aerosol cans. And I always have a cigarette lighter with me as well for a bit of theatre, you know. And I put them on and I say, we're going to make fire. And they go, no, you can't do that, mate, health and safety. You know? Start piling it up and getting the cigarette lighter ready. You know. So how do we do it? We pick up the sticks and a little Zoom recorder or something. You just snap them like that to make little snapping sounds. Lollipop sticks, matchsticks, whatever. Get a good range of different crackles. Aerosol cans. That's our hissing. And then we'll get the newspaper and hold it up real close to the diaphragm on the Zoom and just get the rumbling of the newspaper. Layer those up together and you've got this very nice fire sound. Yeah. The philosophy, the approach that we're using is still procedural, but the implementation we're using is non-digital. And what I'm doing here is giving name to, or revealing a little bit more about what all sound designers do anyway. This is part of the art of sound design, is to deconstruct sounds in such a way that we can produce the components of them using simple, easy methods by analogy, metaphors, simile, choosing objects that have the kind of sonic properties and behavioural characteristics that are like the components that we want in the real sound, and putting them together in such a way it's with smoke and mirrors that the trickery is that you think you're hearing a giant truck passing, when what you're really hearing is a bicycle wheel spinning and somebody banging on a dustbin, right? And that sounds more real than the big truck passing. Sounds more truck-like than the recording of the truck. Why? Because the sound designer has focused on the elements of the sound, the components, which they want to be important in the sound. Does that make sense? Yeah? It's a communication and it involves choice. Simply substituting... there's a really horrible quote by someone I hate called Ayn Rand, just because she's a bit of a fascist. But she has this brilliant thing that absolutely sums up a certain approach to sound design. She said, let me try and get it right. Yeah, sticking blades of grass onto a piece of paper to represent grass is good art therapy for retarded children, but it's not art. And that toxic little comment actually really nails a problem, I think, which is how literally using things can produce a result that's very anodyne. Okay? A sound designer whose sole method of working is to layer recordings is a curator, is a sound photographer. Does that make sense? Not necessarily a sound designer, in the sense that you need to go down more into the micro sound and figure out how sounds work in order to use them as a communicative method. Okay, how much longer do we have today, and how comfortably are you to look at some more examples? Or are we kind of getting close to our time?
We have about half an hour. It really depends on the stamina.
Yeah.
I think if anyone's really bored, you can just, gently leave in
of
like
course
French
you can.
do.
Please don't be...
but I would hate to, because Andy comes to Bristol once in a blue moon. So I'd suggest you show us more examples in the last half hour.
Okay.
And if anyone's feeling like hungry or thirsty, otherwise...
Let me go through a very short, a short series of examples that build on a principle, right? And the principle is this. I'm going to take a micro sound, which is basically just a click. And it looks like this. So, okay, so here's a light switch, and it sounds like this. Right. Why does it sound like that? Because you saw a picture of a light switch, and I said, there's a light switch, and it sounds like this. You go, exactly, that does sound like a light switch, doesn't it? Now, if I'd done that the other way round and just played you a click and said, what's that? You would have got like 50 different answers, okay? So notice this cross-modal perception and how the image leads the sound. You're primed by seeing this to expect that sound to sound like a light switch. And this is, I think, is one of the biggest gifts for sound designers, is that to a large extent, anything that's roughly in the ballpark will work. Yeah? Michel Chon calls it in his concept of syncresis, that there's an audio-visual contract in which the viewer agrees to let that sound stand in for whatever the narrator, the filmmaker, wants it to be. So you don't have to make very, very detailed, but there's some logic to this. The design of this light switch is actually, I think it's 8 kilohertz, or is it 5K? Yeah, 5K filter with a fairly narrow band. I made several recordings of light switches, and I noticed that the sound mainly comes from the plastic housing, comes from the thing onto which the switch is mounted, which is generally a metal or plastic box of roughly the dimensions that give a spectral centroid around about 5K. So the click, which is very similar to the one that we use for the fire, is put through a filter to make it sound like it's coming from a small object. We can get more deeply into this, and we can create more elaborate switches, like these ones here, which sound thus. So notice that these guys now sound like they're fitted to some kind of metal panel, and that this one here sounds like a push to make click in, click out kind of switch. So we can start adding temporal layers of detail. What we've actually got here is several different clicks, and then modelling the mechanics of the switch, which normally has a thing called a rocker bar, which is a piece of metal, sits across the two poles, and as it falls into place, there's actually a spring there that holds it in position, which makes a little ping sound. And many switches are sort of what you call latching, and the spring has a little ratchet on it that clicks in. So you get several of these tiny micro sounds, these little clicks. Here they are individually. And, okay, well, that's a bit nasty, but that's just a little burst of like, what is it, 9K and 10K or something, so they beat together as well. And then when we combine those, we get these. Notice also that they're going through a small resonator, which mimics the acoustic properties of that panel, as in it's like inside a small space. A tiny amount of reverb, if you like.
So is that short ping generated by noise centered around?
It was made by a pair of sine wave oscillators actually, so I chose a very specific frequency that I wanted it to be at, and I put two together. And did you see that I was multiplying them? So I was deliberately creating sidebands. There's actually been a bit AM synthesis going on there. So I've got the carrier and the modulator, and I've also got the sum and difference of them. So I'm ending up with like a small cluster of 4 sine waves. That's the ping that you heard, right? Yeah.
So when you're clicking on, say, that metal panel, you've got various different options.
Yeah.
Whereabouts do you define like the clicking space, so like the coordinates?
Oh, it's the graphics on it.
Yeah.
That's pure trickery. What I did is I hid some buttons behind an image in PD Extended, so you can overlay an image.
Also, in an instance, you can have like layers on top of it.
You
so
can. You can put things behind other things, and they still operate, but you can't see them. So they're like hidden hotspots, like you used to get on HTML pictures or something.
Okay, that's just a variable in that program.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so in this next case, what I've done is it's a kind of little game, right? Okay, so I'll just show you the game. See if I can beat my high score. I probably can't. I'm a bit wasted, but here we go. So, oh man. Nowhere near my high score, like 25. It gets shorter time as well, like, and you could throw in more really ridiculous like ones that you have to work out. Anyway, this is good as an example of a game, and what game using procedural audio, because it's super simple, and yet it contains all of the essential elements. What's the function, sound design wise, of the tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick? What's that all about? Stress. It's called a tension bed, right? You often get this in, say, in a quiz game on TV or something. Right, a tension bed, this thing going on in the background, countdown sort of thing. Come on, get on. You've got to do the thing, right? Then you can hear these snipper sounds. They're also, everything's procedurally made. We'll take it apart in a moment and see. They're supposed to be the wire cutters, and they're action sounds. They confirm for the player that they performed an action. And then there's only one outcome sound to this, which is lose. Like, you can't win this game. Like life, all you can do is just keep it going as long as you can, and then sooner or later, boom, only a lose sound in this game. Yeah. The one that I want to focus on, though, from an interesting sound design perspective, maybe, is the tick tock, which is down here in our time bomb sound. This is the model of the clock, and this is actually a model of the clock exactly like I used to have when I was about like 6 years old or something. It's a Mickey Mouse clock, just like this, with a plastic housing, and of course I took it apart and inside, you can see how it works, right? There's a big spring that stores the energy, and that's released through something called an escapement mechanism, which moves very fast, or like this, and that allows another cog to move around, and then this moves another cog around, and this, and eventually it's gearing down to the hands of the clock. Well, I started looking at the sounds of this when I was writing Designing Sound and researching, you know, the synthesis of ordinary everyday objects, and I put a contact microphone onto a watch and slowed it down about 50 to 100 times. And what I heard was really remarkable. You know, this expression, regular as clockwork, comes because a watch, a mechanical watch, is a completely synchronous mechanical system. And when you slow it right down, what you hear is the escapement mechanism is going like ka-chugga, 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 ka-chugga. And this cog that's moving, and it's hitting the teeth of the cog, and this goes chung. And then the next cog here that moves around goes ka-dum. And then this cog here, shh. And then finally the hand of the clock like goes ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. It's like the second hand. You know, you imagine this time slowed down like 100 times. You can hear all of these actions in slow motion. Ka-ching, ka-ching, chong. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. Wow, and then it did it all over again, and again, and again, following this very deterministic mechanical pattern as energy moves from the unwinding coil eventually into the hands of the clock, and then radiated through the face of the clock, through the body, as acoustical waves off of the surface. It's a very interesting way, by the way, of looking at sound designs, to think of it as a chain of energetic process, to do what we call energy analysis of sounds. Yeah. But I digress. So we've got this model of the clock, and now I want to implement this, or I want to use some methods. And I'm using Microsound as a method. And I'm going to produce all of these clicks like I just did with the light switch, but in such a way that they produce a ticking clock sound. So what we've got here, let's delve into one of them. Let's just kind of start this thing up for a moment and get some sound action here. That high frequency, the escapement mechanism, right? What's going on in there? We've got, oops, yeah, there we go. So I've got two oscillators and envelope generators, and it's just producing very, very short sinusoidal microsounds. A little burst of sine waves at two frequencies which are sounding like a piece of metal moving. So let's mute that one out again for a moment. And let's look at one of these ticks. Well, first of all, let's take the mechanism out of the box. So we'll discard the housing of the clock, which is here. Then we just hear the metal on metal, if you like. And then look inside this subpatch, and we see that this microsound is actually itself composed of other microsounds. Like there's three of them which are being sequenced in very short succession to produce this kind of. Does that make sense? But these individual microsounds, let's look at one, are themselves made of microsounds. Right? And this model that you're seeing here, elaborate though it looks, is a rough attempt using a very short burst of noise. This is called modal synthesis, and a bunch of filters which are tuned to high resonances so that they ring at particular frequencies, to simulate a center-supported circular lamina. So we do a lot of physically informed modelling in procedural audio, where we take standard things like an edge-supported membrane, i.e. a drum skin, right? Or a cantilever bar, like something that's supported at one end. And we use off-the-shelf physical models, heuristics, to get things like this. So this is supposed to be a cog, right? This is a fancy model of a cog. It's something that's held in the centre, it's made of metal, and it's excited at the edge, and it's also damped at the edge by contact with another cog, right? So even though that seems very elaborate, that small subtle detail in the microsound filters up psychologically into your perception of realism of the overall sound. So now we're going to get a series of these again. Okay, and now we're going to combine that with a slightly different version on the offbeat. Right. Put back in the escapement mechanism, and then put it back into the housing. Okay. Now it sounds like it's in a box again. What's kind of fun with this is that there's no reason why I can't start to mess around with this model. Let's make it very slow. And I'm not able to change the physical properties of this at the moment, but let's say we'll make the housing much bigger and slow it down. So instead of that small clock, we can simulate a bigger clock. Maybe we could make the housing have an acoustic absorption, which is more like wood. We could use, processing methods like convolution, where we tap the outside of a piece of wood. We get the convolution coefficients for a wooden sound, and then we're able to use that in building the clock. So we can make kind of virtual materials using analysis that way. Okay. We're done with that. Just to kind of wrap up then, I'll show you just explain what we're doing here. We're starting with very small examples and we're demonstrating reuse. We're building ever more complex sounds, right? But using these same microsound principles to create larger and larger. These all fall into a particular category, by the way, which in my book I call machine art, which is anything mechanical made by human beings as a taxonomy, a class of sounds, because they all have similar design properties, right? In this case, we're going to look next at a fan, and this fan, this is an electric motor. This will really make your teeth hurt. Let's get the speed duration. Get kind of more of a dentist drill kind of up here or something. What's interesting about this, it's modelling a motor, and very briefly you have a thing called a stator around the outside, static, a rotor and brushes and a commutator, and these produce little clicks, and there's a certain resonance of the housing. But also what's interesting is that the way it works physically is that when a motor speeds up under an electric current, its rate of angular acceleration is very high at the beginning, and then it asymptotically moves towards a maximum speed. We've seen that curve before already with a capacitor, right? Yet when we release it, the only force acting is friction, so it has a linear decay. So it has a 1 minus e exponential rise, and then it has a linear decay. And our brains hear that and go, it's an electric motor, because we're so used to hearing that energy model, right? Actual number of objects to produce the motor, like 5 or 6. So it's a very simple DSP model of a motor. But then let's combine a whole bunch of those together. Robot rampage. All we've done there is we've taken the same model and we've instantiated it many times with different parameters. So it's a good example of reuse, right? A lot of systems, you find that you can take a sounding object, and by scaling it or modifying its parameters, it works perfectly for other things. So a giant barrel that you have to push around in a shoot 'em up game is exactly the same as a Coke can that is blowing along the floor in the wind in another part of the game. Yeah, so use this tin can rolling along the ground. It's then scaled up and it becomes a giant oil drum. Same model, different parameters. You just reuse that bit of code. Let's have a look at this one. I just want to talk about fans for a moment. This is a very, very simple model of fans. If you want to see some excellent work on aeroacoustic sounds, my PhD student, Roderick Selfridge, has just presented some really outstanding work on aeolian tones for propellers, for use in games and things like that. So he's just done won a prize at AES for this. This is as simple as you can boil it down to. This is just a series of pulses, and when we make the pulses very narrow, they sound like, see, as a propeller moves around, the fan blade, it's pushing the air out at you, right? So this blade is angled, and as it rotates, it's pushing pulses of air towards you. And this is what we call the on-axis, this purring sound, right? If we rotate around so that we're in the axis of rotation, what we then hear is the edge noise. This is the hissing sound, which, because at this point it's moving towards you, we have a slight Doppler effect where it gets louder in pitch, and then it's receding away from you, it goes down in pitch. So higher, lower, and then depending on the point of view that we look at the fan from, we will hear different mixes of the edge noise and the on-axis noise. So in this next model, we've got that. Yeah, that's more like a propeller sound. You hear that mix of the on-axis pulse modulating the edge noise to produce a propeller sound. I strongly suggest you check out some of Rod's work online and see his demo of a biplane. It's really starting to sound like a decent aircraft, a single propeller. Okay, this next one here, just to set the scenario, who plays Counter-Strike? Oh yes, okay. So you remember the original Valve Half-Life? Okay. You were running around with a crowbar being chased by zombies, and then you will inevitably end up in a room, right? And there's no way out, and there's zombies coming. How do you escape? What is there always in every room in a shooter game that you can escape from? Air vents, yeah. There's like a panel on the wall, and you bash it with the crowbar, and you can climb into the AC system, can't you, and move around. And I loved the first Valve game where they'd modelled the spaces so that when you were in the crawl space, you got like a zone reverb that sounded like you were in a sort of small metal room. Okay. This next example I'm going to show you is designed to be. This is designed to be inside a game, right? And what we have here is an air conditioning system, a more complex fan model. And what you can hear in here is the motor, right, that we made, and the fan. And they're also connected together, they're bound together in terms of to make a single sounding object in an acoustic space. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of go inside the space. There's always a bit where, in order to get past there, you've got to shut the fan down, right? Otherwise you can't get out, so you have to go and find the switch, and then you shut down the power, and you know the drill. Let's go in there and have a look. Oh, well, it looks very complex, but actually there's nothing we haven't seen before here. Here's the motor over here, and notice that they're phase synchronous. They're linked by that line that goes across from the phaser. So this mid-section here, which is the fan model, and then this is feeding into this acoustic system down here at the bottom, which is the crawl space. Now listen carefully when I shut the system down, and this is the advantage of procedural audio over samples. All of these parts are going to work together. We'll shut it down here. Switch it on again. So what you can hear is certain resonances coming in the acoustic space, which highlight the behavioural relationship between the fan and the motor in that space. This is one of the key ideas in procedural audio. It's not about individual sounds, it's about systems. And as the systems become more complex interactive behaviours, not necessarily interactive between the player and the objects, but between the objects and each other, yeah? Those start to come alive until you have a living sound system made of interacting objects. But there's nothing here that we haven't made from basic micro sound and our understanding of the the physics and mechanics of how to make these kind of objects, right? There are more examples, but it's probably a good place to leave it because I think we're right on the time, aren't we?
Yeah, it is great.
Okay, great. Probably time for a few questions.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
So, what kind of coding was behind, the variables I asked about earlier, sort of R, T, B, and Q, etc. What kind of coding goes behind them? Because I've seen them in all of them, but I wasn't quite sure what they were actually processing.
So they're all parameters, and the parameters usually that have been would be exposed to an interface with sliders on. In a production environment where you might be using this to do post-production, and you're working to picture, so you're looking at the thing, and you're going to play with your sounding object model, your synthesis, then you bust them out onto a MIDI fader board, yeah, and you'd call them things like crunchiness for footsteps or whatever. So all of those are something P parameters are those. They're basically a fader somewhere that someone can control, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Are these tools available to buy commercially?
Are what's available to buy?
These tools, say, for instance...
Pool Data's a free tool. It's written by Miller Paquette, and you can download it from the website. So it's a free version than the Max MSP. And arguably better than Max MSP for many reasons, like it being completely open.
I mean, okay, so that's the environment that
Yeah.
you create. I said tools.
Yeah.
I don't know what you call it. Switch.
The code, the patches.
Well, all of these patches are freely downloadable from my website, or they're on the MIT's Media Lab website. So you can grab these. There's now an open courseware of MIT which does all of the stuff in the procedural audio book. I think it's an 18-week course or something. And yeah, I mean, this research, so I published this. There are people who make plugins using procedural audio ideas and sell them commercially. There's Audio Kinetic, have some, and Audio Gaming, which are in the south of France. They produce some plugins that are used in Hollywood films and things like that. But my personal philosophy is I like to teach principles, not products. So my goal with this is to teach you how to do this stuff, rather than buying off-the-shelf plugins. But yeah, and at a higher level, many games now are using procedural audio quite significantly. So the last project that I was involved with consulting for was a planetary space game, No Man's Sky, and they've got animals running around on planets. And Paul Weir, who's the audio director for this, wanted all the animals to have their own sounds. So they're all done with procedural methods like this. They're coded very efficiently by, I think, a guy who's up in Scotland, who rewrote them all in C to be very efficient. But the animal sounds are kind of genetically inherited from... So when you create the animals procedurally, you have a generative algorithm which produces, based on a sort of modified genetic code, which says, will they be furry, will they have long necks, will they have 4 legs, whatever. Then we can use that to say, well, based on their mass, based on the vocal track length and stuff, they'd make this kind of sound. So then we can produce sort of plausible animal sounds for an infinite number of species on different planets. This is one of the big wins with procedural thinking, is that because you're writing the rules to make the code, to make the sounding objects, those rules can generate an infinite number of different varieties of those sounding objects. So GTA now also uses a lot of procedural stuff for their urban environments. I think the last one was about 30% procedural generation, so mostly for vehicles, right, and stuff like that.
Just, Andy, have you mentioned the name of your book? Design
I haven't.
Sound.
It's called Designing Sounds. Yeah, available from.
Yeah, I was wanting to promote that, actually.
Okay.
So, a few things. Well, first of all, round of applause for Andy.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
So,
his book Designing Sound is really amazing. I would sell all my pillows and sleep on that, but I've read it already a few times. And I mean, because this is the tip of the iceberg. And you understand now that this physically informed sound modeling, the power of this, and the commercial potential as well, because you see how it's really changing the game. It is really something very exciting. Worth noting, as he said, PD is a free software. His patches are mostly free online. But actually, all of the techniques that he's shown match Max MSP objects.
You can do all this in Max.
Almost one-to-one. I think the tab read is the only one that is called differently.
There's an important thing to say. Two groups of people have re-implemented all the examples from Designing Sound in different languages. So Dan Stowell from Queen Mary University rewrote most of the first 6 chapters or something in Super Collider, and they're available online. And I've forgotten the chap's name, but one from the C Sounds group has re-implemented loads of these in C Sound, and they sound stunning. They're better than I could ever have imagined that they'd turn out. So that's really good because it validates this idea that the model is separate from the implementation. It's a really important thing to understand, is that you can become a sound designer and understand synthesis without necessarily being good at PD or Super Collider. Maybe you decide to do all this on modular synthesizers, which I think would very much please that.
We could try. So yeah, if you have more questions, we are going to have a little dinner at the canteen and a pint or two before he shoots back off to the south. So you're welcome to join us there. And after that, it's the first ever noise lab in the Crofters Right. So make sure you make it for that. And thanks for coming.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.